I never thought I'd be sitting here, staring at this letter, my heart pounding as I reread the words I wrote to myself months ago. It wasn't meant for anyone else to see, just a private confession to help me process the whirlwind of emotions I'd been feeling. But now, everything is different. The walls I carefully built around my secrets are crumbling, and it's only a matter of time before everything comes crashing down. It started with a moment of vulnerability, a simple, quiet moment when I let my guard down with someone who wasn't my husband. His name is Mark. He's a coworker I've known for years, someone who always seemed to know exactly what to say to make the weight of the day feel lighter. At first, it was harmless. We'd chat about work, share stories about our families, and occasionally laugh about some ridiculous meeting. But one evening, as we worked late on a project, the conversation shifted. "You seem stressed," Mark said, his tone softer than usual. I hesitated. "It's been a tough week. You can talk to me, you know," he said, his eyes warm and sincere. "Sometimes it helps to let it out." And so I did. I told him about the distance I'd been feeling in my marriage, about the way my husband, Eric, seemed more focused on his job than on us. I told him about the nights I lay awake, wondering if this was just a phase or the beginning of the end. Mark listened without judgment, offering understanding in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. That night, I went home feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief because someone had finally heard me, and guilt because that someone wasn't Eric. Over the next few weeks, Mark and I grew closer. We'd grab lunch together, exchange late-night texts about work, and share little pieces of our lives that felt too fragile to share with anyone else. It was addictive, the way he made me feel seen and valued. But the closer we got, the more I felt myself slipping. I started to pull away from Eric, avoiding his questions about my day and brushing off his attempts to reconnect. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that I wasn't doing anything wrong. But deep down, I knew I was treading dangerous waters. One night, after a particularly stressful day, Mark suggested we grab a drink after work. I hesitated but ultimately agreed, convincing myself it was just two colleagues unwinding. But as the evening wore on and the conversation grew more personal, I felt the lines between us blur. "I wish I had someone like you to talk to at home," Mark said, his voice low. The comment hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I didn't know how to respond, so I said nothing. But the way he looked at me, the way his hand brushed mine as we left the bar, it stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the longing. I didn't know how to reconcile the two, so I grabbed a notebook and started writing. I poured out everything, how lonely I'd felt in my marriage, how intoxicating Mark's attention was, and how terrified I was of what it all meant. "You're playing with fire," I wrote to myself. "And you're going to get burned." I told myself the letter was a way to process my feelings, a way to get them out of my head and onto paper where they couldn't hurt anyone. But as the weeks passed, the letter became a constant reminder of the line I'd already crossed. It all came to a head one evening when Eric came home earlier than usual. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when he walked in and gave me a look I couldn't quite read. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Nothing," I said too quickly, my heart racing. Eric frowned, his eyes narrowing. "You've been different lately," he said. "Distant. Is there something you're not telling me?" I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt the weight of the letter pressing down on me, the words I'd written swirling in my mind. "I'm just tired," I said finally, avoiding his gaze. Eric didn't look convinced, but he didn't push further. Instead, he sighed and walked into the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next morning, I arrived at work to find an email from Mark waiting in my inbox. "Can we talk? I feel like there's something we need to figure out." My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen. I knew I should ignore it, that responding would only make things worse. But against my better judgment, I typed back, "Let's meet after work." That evening, we met at a quiet cafe a few blocks from the office. Mark looked nervous, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something more serious. "I've been thinking about us," he said, his voice hesitant. "There is no us," I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. "You don't believe that," he said, his eyes searching mine. I looked away, my hands trembling. "Mark, this isn't right. We can't keep doing this." "I know," he said softly. "But I care about you, Caroline. More than I probably should." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, that he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But all I could think about was Eric, about the promises I'd made and the life we'd built together. "I need time," I said finally, my voice breaking. Mark nodded, his expression a mix of understanding and sadness. "Take all the time you need," he said. "But don't wait too long." As I drove home that night, Mark's words echoed in my mind. Don't wait too long. But what was I waiting for? To confess everything to Eric and risk losing him? To dive headfirst into something with Mark and hope it didn't fall apart? I didn't have the answers. All I had was the letter, the words I'd written to myself in a moment of clarity, and the sinking feeling that no matter what choice I made, someone was going to get hurt. I sat at my desk the next morning, staring blankly at my computer screen as the weight of my decisions pressed down on me. The email from Mark still lingered in my mind, his words replaying like a broken record, "Take all the time you need, but don't wait too long." It wasn't a threat, it was a plea. And the worst part was, I didn't know what I was waiting for. That day passed in a blur of half-hearted meetings and distracted conversations. I avoided Mark, keeping to the far side of the office and burying myself in meaningless tasks. But even as I tried to distance myself, I felt the pull of our last conversation, the unspoken connection that hung between us like a thread stretched too tight. At home, Eric was quieter than usual, his glances lingering on me a little too long, as though he were trying to read my thoughts. It was subtle, but I felt the shift, the way he hesitated before speaking, the way his touch lingered for a second longer than necessary, as though he were trying to ground himself in a relationship that was slipping through his fingers. "You've been distracted lately," he said one evening as we sat across from each other at the dinner table. "Work's been stressful," I replied, the excuse slipping from my lips before I even thought about it. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. That night, as Eric worked late in his office, I found myself drawn to the drawer where I'd hidden the letter. I hadn't looked at it in weeks, but now, with everything hanging by a thread, I needed to remind myself of the truths I'd once been too afraid to face. I unfolded the pages, my hands trembling as I read the words I'd written. "You're playing with fire. And you're going to get burned." The honesty in those lines hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known, even then, that this wouldn't end well. Yet I'd still let it happen. The next morning, as I left for work, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something out of place. It wasn't until I was halfway to the office that it hit me, I hadn't put the letter back in its hiding spot. Panic set in as I thought about Eric finding it. What would he think? Would he even confront me, or would he let the knowledge fester in silence until it became something we couldn't come back from? By the time I arrived home that evening, my heart was pounding. I rushed to the drawer, praying the letter was still there. But it wasn't. Instead, it was sitting on the kitchen table, neatly folded, with a cup of untouched coffee beside it. Eric sat across from it, his expression unreadable. "Do you want to explain this?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with tension. I froze, my mind scrambling for an excuse, but none came. "Eric, You were going to tell me, weren't you?" he interrupted, his gaze piercing. "Yes," I said quickly, though the lie felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "I just didn't know how." His expression softened slightly, but the hurt in his eyes was unmistakable. "Caroline, if there's something going on, I need to know. I can't keep living like this, feeling like I'm the only one trying to make this work." I wanted to tell him everything in that moment, to lay it all out and finally free myself from the weight of my lies. But the fear of losing him kept me silent. "There's nothing going on," I said, forcing the words out even as guilt clawed at my throat. "I've just been struggling with work and other things. But it's not about us, Eric. I promise." He studied me for a long moment before nodding, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. "If that's the truth, then fine," he said. "But if there's more, Caroline, I need you to tell me. I don't want to find out later." At work the next day, Mark approached me in the break room. His usual light-hearted demeanor was replaced by something heavier, more serious. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. "Mark, I don't think it's important," he cut me off. Reluctantly, I followed him to an empty conference room. "I overheard something," he said, shutting the door behind us. "One of our co-workers, Sarah, she's been asking questions about us. About you." My heart sank. "Why would she do that?" Mark hesitated, then said, "She's been watching us, Caroline. She's seen how close we've gotten. And I think she's jealous." "Jealous?" I repeated, my mind racing. "She made a comment the other day about how everyone has secrets." I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, he trailed off, his expression dark. "What should we do?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "Be careful," Mark said. "That's all we can do for now." That evening, as I sat at my desk, an email notification popped up on my screen. The subject line read, "Does your husband know?" My blood ran cold as I opened the message. Inside was a single sentence: "Secrets have a way of coming out." Attached was a photo of Mark and me sitting together at the cafe, our heads close as we talked. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. Whoever had sent this knew everything, and they were ready to use it against me. The ticking clock. For days, I lived in a state of constant dread, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Eric was more distant than ever, his quiet demeanor masking the storm I knew was brewing beneath the surface. At work, Sarah's presence became unbearable. Every time I saw her, I felt her gaze lingering on me, her smirk a reminder that she held all the cards. The weight of it all was crushing, and for the first time in months, I felt truly alone. The email haunted me for days. Every time I opened my laptop, I half expected another message, something even worse than the first, a threat, a demand, or worse, the revelation that Eric had already seen it. The photo of Mark and me, sitting close at the cafe, felt like a bomb ticking down to zero, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my carefully constructed life was about to collapse. At home, Eric's silence was louder than ever. He wasn't cold, but he wasn't warm either. He moved through the house like a ghost, his presence there but not there. He'd ask about my day, and I'd give short, non-committal answers, terrified that he'd push further and ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. Mark, on the other hand, was relentless. He pulled me aside at work every chance he got, his tone urgent and his words a mix of concern and warning. "Sarah's up to something," he said one afternoon in the break room, his voice low. "I caught her talking to Greg from IT. She asked if he could pull up your email history." My stomach dropped. "What did he say?" "He said no, but that doesn't mean she's going to stop," Mark replied. "We need to figure out what she wants." "What do you think she wants?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He sighed. "She wants to ruin us. Or maybe just you." The realization sent a chill down my spine. The next day, I found Sarah in the copy room, leaning casually against the counter as she scrolled through her phone. I didn't plan what I was going to say, but the anger bubbling inside me propelled me forward. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice sharp. Sarah glanced up, her expression the picture of innocence. "Excuse me?" "You know exactly what I mean," I said, stepping closer. "The emails, the photo, why are you doing this?" She smirked, setting her phone down. You really think I'm the bad guy here? What would you call someone who's trying to destroy someone else's life? I shot back. I'd call them someone who's tired of watching other people get away with things they shouldn't, she said, her tone calm but cutting. What do you want, Sarah? I asked, my voice breaking. What's your endgame? She tilted her head, feigning thoughtfulness. Honestly? I just want to see how far you'll go to keep your little secret. That evening, another email arrived, this time with a subject line that made my blood run cold, tick-tock. Inside was a video clip of Mark and me sitting in the cafe, our heads close as we talked. The angle was poor, but the intimacy of the moment was unmistakable. Below the video was a single sentence, it only takes one click. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands trembling. Whoever was behind this wasn't just toying with me, they were holding my life in their hands. The next morning, I pulled Mark aside as soon as I arrived at work. It's getting worse, I said, showing him the email on my phone. His jaw tightened as he watched the video. This is blackmail, he said. We can't let them get away with this. What are we supposed to do? I asked, my voice shaking. If this gets out, Eric, I couldn't finish the sentence. Mark looked at me, his expression hard. We'll figure it out, he said. But first, we need to figure out who's behind this. That night, Eric was waiting for me when I got home. He sat at the kitchen table, his phone in his hand and his expression grim. What's this? He asked, sliding the phone across the table. I stared at the screen, my heart sinking as I saw the video from the email playing. The timestamp confirmed what I already knew, he'd received it too. Eric, Don't, he interrupted, his voice cold. Don't lie to me, Caroline. Just tell me the truth. The words caught in my throat, the weight of everything I'd been hiding pressing down on me like a stone. It's not what it looks like, I said weakly. Then what is it? He demanded, his voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around behind my back with someone from your office. It wasn't an affair, I said quickly. I mean, it didn't go that far. Then how far did it go? He asked, his eyes narrowing. I hesitated, my mind racing for the right words. We talked, I said finally. We got close. But I ended it, Eric. I swear. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice breaking. Why did you let me believe everything was fine while you were doing this? I was scared, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. I didn't want to lose you. Eric shook his head, standing abruptly. Well, congratulations, he said bitterly. Because you just might. Eric slept in the guest room that night, and the silence between us the next morning was deafening. At work, Mark avoided me, his usual confidence replaced by a heavy unease. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to revel in the chaos she'd created, her smirk a constant reminder that she held all the cards. I knew I couldn't go on like this. The guilt, the fear, the constant sense of dread, it was all consuming me. But I didn't know how to fix it, or if it was even fixable. 1 week later, I received an email from HR requesting a meeting. When I arrived, my manager and an HR representative were waiting for me, their expressions serious. We've received a complaint, they began, their words measured but firm. As they outlined the allegations against me, I felt the ground beneath me crumble. It was all there, the emails, the photos, the rumors Sarah had been spreading like wildfire. By the end of the meeting, I was given a choice: resign quietly or face formal disciplinary action. I chose to resign. With my career in shambles and my marriage hanging by a thread, I realized I had reached a crossroads. I could keep running from the consequences of my actions, or I could finally face them head-on. For the first time in months, I opened my laptop and began to write, not a confession, but a promise. A promise to myself to do better, to be better. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days after my resignation blurred together, a hollow routine of silence and avoidance. With no job to go to, I spent my mornings staring at my coffee, my afternoons scrolling aimlessly through job postings, and my evenings grappling with the overwhelming sense of failure that had taken root in my chest. The house felt emptier than ever. Eric still stayed in the guest room, his presence a cold reminder of how much I'd lost. Conversations were brief and stilted, limited to logistical questions like, "Do you need anything from the store?" or "What time are you heading out?" The worst part was knowing I deserved this. I had created this mess, brick by brick, with every secret I kept and every lie I told. And now, faced with the wreckage, I didn't know where to begin rebuilding, or if rebuilding was even possible. One morning, as I was sorting through a box of old papers in an attempt to feel productive, I found the letter again. The one I'd written to myself in the quiet, guilt-ridden hours before everything spiraled out of control. The edges were worn now, the paper crumpled from being shoved in a drawer, but the words were still the same. "You're playing with fire. And you're going to get burned." I sat on the floor, the letter in my lap, and cried for the first time in weeks. It wasn't the kind of quiet, cathartic crying you see in movies. It was raw and ugly, the kind of crying that leaves your chest heaving and your throat raw. I cried for the person I used to be, for the person I'd hurt Eric by becoming, and for the uncertainty of whether we'd ever find our way back to each other. Later that evening, Eric found me sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. He hesitated in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. I nodded, muting the TV and turning to face him. He sat down across from me, leaving a chasm of space between us. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he began, his eyes fixed on the floor. "And I need to know, why? Why him? Why not talk to me?" The question hit harder than I expected, and for a moment, I couldn't find the words. "It wasn't about him," I said eventually, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was about how I felt, how lonely I was, how invisible I felt. And I didn't know how to tell you without feeling like I was failing us." Eric looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain. "Do you think I didn't feel lonely too? Do you think I didn't notice that we were drifting apart? Then why didn't you say anything?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Because I thought we'd figure it out," he said. "Because I trusted you." The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Eric. If I could take it back, I would." He sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I don't know if sorry is enough," he admitted. The next day, I reached out to a therapist. It was a decision I'd been avoiding for weeks, convincing myself that I could handle everything on my own. But deep down, I knew I needed help, not just to process what had happened, but to understand why I'd made the choices I did. In therapy, I began to unpack the layers of guilt, shame, and insecurity that had built up over years of unspoken resentment and unmet expectations. I realized how much of my identity I'd tied to being the perfect partner, and how that perfectionism had blinded me to the cracks in my relationship with Eric. Eric, to his credit, agreed to join me for a few sessions. At first, the conversations were strained, filled with long silences and hesitant admissions. But slowly, we began to peel back the layers of our pain, acknowledging the ways we'd both contributed to the breakdown of our marriage. "I didn't realize how much I'd been shutting you out," Eric admitted during one session. "I thought focusing on work was helping us, but I see now that it just made you feel more alone." "And I should have told you how I was feeling," I said. "Instead of looking for answers somewhere else." It wasn't a perfect process. Some days felt like progress, while others felt like we were spinning in circles. But for the first time in months, it felt like we were finally moving in the same direction. One afternoon, as I was scrolling through my email, I saw a message from Mark. The subject line simply read, "Goodbye." I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a short note. Caroline, I've accepted a job in another city. I think it's for the best. I hope you find the happiness you're looking for. Take care of yourself. I stared at the screen, a mix of relief and sadness washing over me. Mark had been a constant presence in my life for months, and while our relationship had been a source of pain, it had also been a source of comfort. But I knew he was right, this was for the best. I didn't reply. Instead, I closed the email and let the chapter close. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the fractures in my marriage began to heal. Eric and I started spending more time together, going for walks, cooking meals, and rediscovering the small joys we'd once taken for granted. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eric reached for my hand. I don't know if we'll ever be the same, he said. But I think we can be better. I squeezed his hand, my heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and hope. I think so too, I said. It wasn't a perfect resolution. The scars of what had happened would always be there, a reminder of the choices we'd made and the lessons we'd learned. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving forward, together. The house felt lighter, but not completely whole. Eric and I had started talking again, not just surface-level pleasantries, but the deeper conversations we hadn't had in years. It was strange how honesty, even the painful kind, could be a salve. But it wasn't a cure. There were still moments when silence stretched between us, heavy with things we weren't ready to say. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Eric paused it suddenly and turned to me. "Do you regret telling me the truth?" he asked, his voice soft but weighted. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "No," I said honestly. "I regret what I did. But I don't regret telling you. If I hadn't, I don't think we'd even have a chance right now." Eric nodded, his gaze distant. "It's hard," he admitted. "Every time I look at you, I see it. Not just what happened, but all the little ways we let each other down. And I hate that. Because I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how to forget." "I don't think you're supposed to forget," I said quietly. "I think you're just supposed to figure out how to live with it." In therapy, I'd started working on understanding myself, not just as a wife, but as a person. I realized how much of my identity I'd tied to being everything for everyone, the supportive partner, the reliable coworker, the friend who always listened but never asked for anything in return. Over time, I'd lost sight of who I was outside of those roles, and it left me vulnerable in ways I hadn't recognized until it was too late. "Have you thought about what makes you happy?" my therapist asked during one session. The question caught me off guard. Happiness had always felt like something tied to others, Eric's smile, a kind word from a colleague, a successful project at work. But what about me? What did I want? "I don't know," I admitted. "That's okay," she said. "But maybe it's time to start finding out." I decided to take her advice. I signed up for a painting class at the community center, something I hadn't done since college but had always loved. The first class felt awkward, like I was trying on a version of myself I barely remembered. But by the third week, I found myself looking forward to it, the simple act of putting brush to canvas soothing in a way I hadn't expected. Eric noticed the change. One evening, as I was cleaning up my supplies, he smiled at me in a way that felt familiar, almost like the early days of our relationship. "You seem happier," he said. "I think I am," I replied, surprised at the truth in my words. Things seemed to be improving between us, but then came the inevitable test. One morning, as I scrolled through my emails, I saw a familiar name in my inbox, Mark. My chest tightened as I opened the message. "I hope this isn't crossing a line, but I wanted to say thank you. For everything. I've started a new job, and I'm doing well. I hope you are too." The email was brief and polite, but seeing his name brought back a flood of memories. Part of me wanted to respond, to close that chapter with a sense of finality. But I knew that reaching out, even with good intentions, would only complicate things. I deleted the email and closed my laptop, my hands trembling slightly. That evening, as Eric and I sat down for dinner, I debated whether to tell him about the email. Eventually, I decided to bring it up. "I got an email from Mark today," I said, my voice steady. Eric froze for a moment, his fork hovering midair. "What did he want?" "Just to say thank you," I said. "He wanted me to know he's doing well." Eric's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Did you respond?" "No," I said firmly. "I deleted it." His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded again. "Good," he said. "I'm glad you told me." That moment felt like a turning point. For the first time, I wasn't hiding anything, not even the small things that might have been easier to keep to myself. And while it didn't erase the past, it felt like a step in the right direction. Eric and I started going on weekly dates again, something we hadn't done in years. At first, it was awkward, like we were trying to remember how to be with each other outside of the routines of daily life. But over time, it became something we both looked forward to. One evening, as we walked home from a small Italian restaurant, Eric reached for my hand. "I think we're getting there," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Yeah," I said, squeezing his hand. "I think so too." Despite the progress we were making, I knew there was still one loose end I needed to address: Sarah. She had been the catalyst for so much of the chaos in my life, and while I hated her for what she'd done, I also knew I couldn't move forward without confronting the lingering anger I felt toward her. I reached out to a mutual acquaintance at work, someone who'd always been kind to me, and asked how Sarah was doing. "She left the company a few weeks after you did," they said. "I think she felt the heat after everything that happened." The news surprised me. I had built Sarah up in my mind as this unshakable force, someone who thrived on chaos. But hearing that she'd left made her seem human. For the first time, I felt something other than anger toward her. I felt pity. Months turned into a year, and while things weren't perfect, they were better. Eric and I had found a rhythm again, one built on honesty and mutual effort. I continued painting, finding joy in the simple act of creating something for myself. And slowly, I started to believe that I deserved the second chance I'd been given. One evening, as Eric and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to me and said, "You know, I think we're stronger now than we were before." I smiled, leaning my head on his shoulder. "I think so too," I said. It wasn't a happy ending in the traditional sense. There were still scars, still moments when the past threatened to resurface. But it was an ending built on growth, forgiveness, and the hope of something better. And for us, that was enough. 1 year after everything fell apart, my life looked different, quieter, simpler, but in many ways fuller. There were no more secrets, no more late-night emails or lingering doubts about who I was becoming. For the first time in years, I felt like I could look in the mirror and face my reflection without flinching. Eric and I had settled into what I'd come to think of as our new normal. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. There were still moments when he'd ask me a question, and I could feel the weight of the past in his voice, a subtle reminder that trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But those moments were fewer now, and the love we'd fought so hard to salvage felt steadier, like an anchor. One afternoon, while cleaning out the guest room, I found a photo album I hadn't seen in years. Inside were pictures from the early days of our marriage, vacations, family gatherings, silly selfies we'd taken just because. I ran my fingers over the glossy pages, marveling at how young and carefree we looked. For a long time, I sat on the floor flipping through those memories, a mix of nostalgia and gratitude swelling in my chest. We weren't those people anymore, but maybe that was okay. In therapy, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the choices that had led me to this point, not just the affair, but the years of small, unspoken resentments and insecurities that had built up like rust. I realized how much I'd relied on external validation to feel whole, how I'd looked to Mark to fill a void that only I could truly address. "Do you think you've forgiven yourself?" my therapist asked one day. The question caught me off guard. I'd spent so much energy trying to earn Eric's forgiveness that I hadn't stopped to consider whether I'd forgiven myself. "I don't know," I admitted. "It's okay if you haven't," she said. "But remember, forgiveness isn't just about letting go of guilt. It's about giving yourself permission to move forward." That idea stuck with me. For so long, I'd carried the weight of my mistakes like a penance, as if punishing myself was the only way to make amends. But slowly, I began to see that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning from it and choosing to do better. Painting had become more than just a hobby, it was a lifeline. Each brushstroke felt like a small act of reclaiming something I'd lost, a sense of creativity, of joy, of purpose. One day, I signed up for a local art show, submitting a few of my pieces on a whim. To my surprise, one of them was selected for display. When I told Eric, he smiled in a way that reminded me of the man I'd fallen in love with. "I'm proud of you," he said, and I believed him. The night of the show, he stood beside me as we admired the painting, a simple landscape of a quiet forest at sunset. "This feels like us," he said softly. I looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "It's peaceful, but it's not perfect," he said. "There are shadows, but they don't take away from the beauty." His words stayed with me, a reminder that even imperfect things can be whole. As Eric and I continued to rebuild our marriage, we found new ways to connect. We started a weekly tradition of cooking dinner together, something simple, like pasta or stir-fry, but it became a time to talk and laugh without the distractions of work or screens. One evening, as we chopped vegetables side by side, Eric asked, "Do you ever think about what might have happened if things had gone differently?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I try not to dwell on it. It's too easy to get stuck in the what-ifs." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think about it too," he said. "But then I remind myself that we're here. We're still trying. That has to mean something." "It means everything," I said, and I meant it. One night, unable to sleep, I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out a notebook. I hadn't written anything personal since the letter I'd hidden months ago, the one that had almost cost me everything. But this time, the words came easily. "Dear Caroline," I wrote. "You've come a long way. A year ago, you felt lost, broken, and unsure if you deserved a second chance. But look at you now. You've faced the truth, owned your mistakes, and found a way to rebuild, not just your marriage, but yourself. It wasn't easy, and it never will be. But you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Keep going. Keep growing. You're worth it." When I finished, I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of my journal. I didn't need to hide it this time. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected message on social media. It was from Sarah. My hands shook as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she wrote. "I was angry and jealous, and I let that get the better of me. I hope you're doing okay." Her apology felt both surprising and hollow. I didn't know if it was genuine or just an attempt to ease her own guilt, but I realized it didn't matter. I didn't need her apology to move on. I wrote back a short reply, "Thank you. I hope you're doing okay too." And then I closed the chapter for good. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. Eric and I were planning a weekend getaway to the mountains, something we hadn't done in years. My painting had become more than a hobby, it was a part of who I was. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself, not just for others. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eric turned to me and said, "Do you think we'll ever stop looking back?" I thought about it for a moment before replying. "Maybe not completely," I said. "But I think that's okay. As long as we keep moving forward." He nodded, taking my hand in his. "Here's to moving forward," he said, and we sat there in comfortable silence, the past behind us and the future stretching out like a blank canvas. A year and a half had passed since the moment I'd thought my life was over, and while the wounds weren't fully healed, they'd become scars, visible reminders of pain that had shaped me but no longer defined me. Forgiveness, I'd learned, was neither quick nor linear. It ebbed and flowed, its progress marked by moments of connection and setbacks of lingering doubt. Eric and I were still together, though the word together meant something different now. It wasn't the seamless, effortless partnership we'd had in the early days of our marriage, but it was deeper in its own way. It was intentional, deliberate, and built on a shared understanding that perfection wasn't the goal, growth was. Therapy had taught me that forgiving myself wasn't about absolving my mistakes but learning from them. There were still nights when I lay awake, replaying the choices I'd made and wondering how things might have turned out differently. But more often now, I reminded myself of what I'd gained from facing those choices head-on, a stronger sense of who I was, the courage to be honest with myself and others, and the determination to never let complacency define my relationships again. "You're allowed to forgive yourself," my therapist had told me during one session. "Not because you deserve a free pass, but because holding on to guilt doesn't make you better. It just keeps you stuck." Those words stayed with me, a quiet mantra I repeated to myself on the harder days. Eric's forgiveness wasn't something he gave all at once, it came in pieces, each one earned through conversations, shared experiences, and the passage of time. There were still moments when I'd catch him staring at me, his brow furrowed as if he were remembering everything we'd been through. And there were nights when he'd bring it up, not out of anger, but because the wound still ached. "Do you think we'll ever forget?" he asked me one evening as we sat on the couch, the soft glow of the TV illuminating his face. "I don't think forgetting is the point," I said. "I think it's about remembering in a way that doesn't hurt anymore." He nodded slowly, his hand reaching for mine. "I want to get there," he said. "And we will," I promised, though I knew it wouldn't happen overnight. Rebuilding trust wasn't something either of us could do alone. It took both of us being willing to show up, even on the days when it felt easier to pull away. We set aside time each week to check in with each other, to talk about how we were feeling and address any lingering doubts or fears. It wasn't always easy, some conversations ended in tears, others in frustration, but it was worth it. One of the biggest turning points came during a weekend trip to the mountains. It was Eric's idea, a chance to get away from the routines and pressures of daily life. We spent the days hiking, the evenings by the fire, and the nights talking about everything and nothing. On the last night, as we sat on the porch of our cabin, Eric turned to me and said, "I think I'm ready to let it go." "Let what go?" I asked, though I already knew. "The anger," he said. "The resentment. It's not helping me, and it's not helping us. I want to move forward." His words felt like a weight lifting from my chest. "Me too," I said softly. Looking back, I realized how much I'd learned, not just about relationships, but about myself. I'd learned that love isn't always enough if it isn't nurtured, that communication is more than just talking, and that avoiding hard truths only makes them harder to face in the long run. I'd also learned the importance of self-awareness and self-worth. For so long, I'd looked to others to validate me, to fill the gaps I felt in myself. But now, I understood that true happiness and fulfillment had to come from within. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out an old box of papers, I found the letter I'd written to myself at the start of everything. The edges were worn, the ink slightly faded, but the words still hit me with the same force they had when I'd first written them. "You're playing with fire. And you're going to get burned." I sat down and read the letter from start to finish, marveling at how far I'd come since those words had been written. When I reached the end, I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. It wasn't something I needed to revisit anymore, but I wasn't ready to throw it away either. It was a part of my story, a reminder of the lessons I'd learned and the person I was working to become. Today, my life isn't perfect, but it's mine. Eric and I are in a better place, stronger, more honest, and more connected than we've been in years. I've continued painting, even selling a few pieces at local art shows. I've started a new job, one where I've set clear boundaries and prioritized balance over perfection. And most importantly, I've learned to forgive myself, not completely, not all at once, but enough to keep moving forward. One evening, as Eric and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to me and said, "Do you think we'll ever get back to how we used to be?" I thought about it for a moment before replying. "I don't think we need to," I said. "I think we can be something better." He smiled, his hand finding mine. "Yeah," he said. "I think we can." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it.